The streets of New York shimmered with the energy of the roaring 20s. Neon lights reflected off polished sidewalks, and jazz spilled from every speakeasy like a river of sound, intoxicating the city in rhythm and exuberance. On Wall Street, brokers shouted across the trading floor, fingers flying over paper slips as the ticker tape announced fortunes rising and falling with dizzying speed. Among them, James Carter stood tall, a young man of ambition and charm, his suit impeccably tailored, his confidence almost palpable. He thrived in this world of risk, where a single gamble could turn a clerk into a millionaire overnight. James had become one of the rising stars on the stock exchange, his name whispered in the corridors of wealth as someone who knew the market better than it knew itself. Yet, just a few hundred miles away in Detroit, the rhythm of prosperity was slower, weighed down by toil and sweat. Clara Thompson, a factory worker with calloused hands and determined eyes, labored on the assembly line of an automobile plant. She moved with efficiency and precision, assembling parts for engines she would never own. Her pay barely covered rent and groceries, yet she dreamed of more, a life beyond the gray soot and relentless hum of machinery. Clara's mother, who had once believed in the promise of America, now warned her daughter that wealth seemed fleeting, a glittering illusion that slipped through ordinary hands as easily as sand. The disparity between their worlds was stark. James dined on expensive steaks and drank champagne at exclusive clubs, while Clara and her neighbors shared cramped apartments and rationed meals. Yet, despite their differences, an invisible thread tied them together, the fragile thread of a nation poised on the edge of disaster. Beneath the surface of prosperity, the foundations were cracking. Banks were lending recklessly, brokers were buying stocks on margin with borrowed money, and farmers, struggling with plummeting crop prices, whispered warnings that few wanted to hear. Most Americans, caught in the euphoria of excess, ignored these signs. The country believed in its invincibility, and that belief would soon shatter. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. In late September of 1929, James noticed small tremors in the market. Prices wavered and a few of his colleagues expressed concern about overvalued stocks. James, however, dismissed it as temporary volatility. The market always corrects itself, he told himself, and he doubled down on his bets, confident that his instincts were infallible. Clara, meanwhile, faced her own quiet warnings. Orders at the factory slowed, and whispers of layoffs reached her ears. The men who had always been confident in their steady employment now looked anxious, their eyes carrying a weight of uncertainty that Clara had never seen before. Yet she kept her head down, focused on survival, unaware that the storm approaching her city would be unlike anything she had ever imagined. By October, the tension became palpable. On October 24, 1929, later remembered as Black Thursday, panic erupted on the trading floor. Brokers scrambled, shouting orders, papers flying like leaves in a gale. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he watched prices plummet, millions vanishing in minutes. The air was thick with desperation, a frenzy that seemed almost apocalyptic. But still, James believed he could ride it out, that the market would stabilize, that fortune would favor him. He wasn't alone in his hubris. Countless investors, confident in their wealth, ignored the growing signs of ruin. The following week brought Black Monday and Black Tuesday, when the stock market collapsed completely. James, along with millions of Americans, watched in horror as their fortunes evaporated, wiped away in a single, merciless sweep. His lavish apartment, his fast cars, his reputation, everything that had defined him, crumbled overnight. Panic spread beyond Wall Street. Banks failed, savings accounts disappeared, and ordinary citizens, including Clara's neighbors, suddenly found themselves destitute. The streets of cities that had once bustled with prosperity now bore a heavy silence, punctuated by the cries of those who had lost everything. Clara felt the impact immediately. The factory where she had worked for years closed its doors without warning. Families were evicted, and neighbors gathered what little they could salvage as they were forced to leave their homes. Clara's own apartment, though modest, seemed vulnerable now, the rent unaffordable as her wages disappeared. Hunger became a constant companion, and the specter of desperation loomed over every decision. Yet, even amid the fear, Clara refused to surrender entirely to despair. She began forming small networks with neighbors, sharing food and resources, finding strength in solidarity, in human connection, in the quiet acts of kindness that sometimes slipped through the cracks of catastrophe. Meanwhile, James struggled to reconcile his former life with his present reality. Once a figure of influence and power, he now stood in soup lines, clutching a ticket for a loaf of bread, the reality of human fragility pressing down on him like a physical weight. He encountered Clara one afternoon while searching for work at a nearby community kitchen. Though their lives had been worlds apart, in this moment their paths intersected, both defined by resilience in the face of adversity. James, humbled by loss, and Clara, hardened by struggle, became emblematic of a nation on the brink, shaken but unbroken, terrified yet determined to survive. As the weeks turned into months, America itself seemed to hold its breath. The initial shock gave way to a creeping awareness. The Depression was not a temporary setback, but a profound and pervasive collapse, touching every corner of the country. From the urban tenements to the sprawling farms of the Midwest, from the roaring cities to the silent plains, Americans confronted a new reality. The glittering world of the 1920s had vanished, replaced by breadlines, foreclosures, and the relentless struggle for survival. Yet, amid the darkness, there were sparks of hope. Communities leaned on one another, strangers became allies, and ordinary citizens discovered reserves of courage and ingenuity they had never known existed. Clara and James, like so many others, learned that survival was not merely about money or status, but about adaptability, empathy, and sheer determination. They were at the start of a long journey, one that would test the limits of endurance, challenge the very fabric of society, and reshape the nation in ways that would echo for generations. By the end of 1929, America had been irrevocably transformed. The roaring excitement of the past decade had given way to uncertainty and fear. Yet in the hearts of people like Clara and James, there remained a fragile, flickering light of hope, a determination to endure, to fight, and to rebuild. The Great Depression had begun, and the nation was about to learn lessons of humility, resilience, and survival that no wealth or privilege could have taught. The winter of 1930 arrived with a cruel bite. Snow dusted the streets of New York, but it did little to soften the chill that had settled over the city. Bread lines snaked for blocks, men and women huddled together for warmth, and the once bustling neighborhoods of Manhattan now seemed hollowed, their vibrancy replaced by the muted rhythms of survival. James Carter, once a rising star of Wall Street, moved among the crowd with a hollowed look in his eyes. The suits and cufflinks that had marked his status were gone. Now he wore patched clothing, clutching a small satchel that contained what little money he had left. The collapse of the stock market had done more than destroy fortunes. It had shredded lives. Banks, overwhelmed with withdrawals and the collapse of investments, had closed their doors permanently. People who had believed their savings were secure now faced destitution. Families were evicted, losing homes they had spent years paying for. The city streets became a gallery of despair. Shuttered stores, silent theaters, and the occasional figure hunched over a makeshift fire. James had watched it unfold and realized, in a gut-punch moment of clarity, that no amount of skill, charm, or ambition could have prepared him for this. Meanwhile, in Detroit, Clara Thompson fought her own battles. The factory where she had worked, once a place of rhythmic labor and modest stability, was shuttered. Machines that had roared for decades now sat silent, coated with dust and rust. She scavenged the neighborhood for work, but every door seemed closed. Some neighbors had already left town, chasing vague promises of employment in California, joining the millions fleeing the Dust Bowl and economic ruin. Clara, however, refused to leave. She believed in the power of community, and she refused to abandon those who could not leave, helping to organize a small network of families who pooled what little they had to survive. The Dust Bowl had turned the heartland into a wasteland. Fields in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and surrounding states were parched and cracked, stripped bare by years of poor agricultural practices and relentless drought. Massive dust storms, black as midnight, swept across farms, destroying crops and choking anyone caught outside. Farmers, their livelihoods obliterated, began westward treks in rusting trucks and wagons, hoping to find work picking fruit in California. Families like the Thompsons' friends carried children across highways, hoping the journey would promise life rather than despair. Dust clung to skin, clothes, and lungs, a constant reminder that nature itself seemed allied with hardship. In these desperate times, even survival required cunning. Clara bartered sewing services for food, helped neighbors scavenge firewood, and participated in informal kitchens that fed dozens of families daily. The work was exhausting, but she discovered that cooperation was essential. Communities that shared resources survived, those that hoarded fell apart. It was a lesson the wealthiest Americans would learn too late, as James began to witness. He worked odd jobs, delivering parcels, assisting in small construction crews, even cleaning streets, always aware that his previous status offered no immunity. Everywhere the human toll was visible. Children went to school hungry, teachers tried to teach while stomachs growled, men wandered from town to town, carrying their pride like a burden, seeking any work, often sleeping in makeshift camps along railroad tracks. Crime rose as desperation grew, not out of malice but necessity. Families rationed everything: food, clothing, even hope. The stark reality was that the Depression had stripped life down to its essentials: survival, dignity, and the bonds between people. Amid the despair, glimmers of courage and ingenuity emerged. Clara found herself at the center of a women's group that organized soup kitchens and small-scale barter networks. One morning, she found herself distributing bread and boiled vegetables to 30 families crammed into a dimly lit basement. She knew the food was barely enough, yet the relief and gratitude in the eyes of the children and elderly reminded her why she kept going. Each day was a battle, a mixture of exhaustion and determination. James, too, discovered resilience. One particularly cold morning, he arrived at a construction site for a New York City project. The foreman, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, handed him a shovel. James had never lifted a spade for a living, yet he dug trenches and hauled bricks, feeling muscles strain in ways his previous life had never demanded. At night, he returned to the shelter where he had been allowed a cot. There, men shared stories of loss and perseverance, and James began to understand the depth of what the Depression had revealed. Survival was not a matter of wealth, but courage, adaptability, and community. The journey westward brought further revelations. Trains crowded with families and dust-streaked faces carried hopeful migrants who had lost everything. At every stop, vendors offered food and water at inflated prices, taking advantage of desperation. Yet camaraderie also emerged among the travelers. Strangers shared blankets, warned one another of dangerous roads, and swapped tips on finding work. The harsh landscape forced people to rely on one another, forging connections that were as essential as the food they carried. Political tension grew alongside economic hardship. The public demanded action, protesting against government inaction and advocating for policies that could provide relief. It was in this climate that Franklin D. Roosevelt began rising as a figure of hope, promising a New Deal that would put Americans back to work and restore confidence. People like Clara and James paid attention, realizing that survival alone was not enough. The country needed leadership and systemic change. Yet, even with the promise of reform, despair lingered. Families like Clara's neighbors went to bed hungry, James sometimes faced ridicule or suspicion in soup lines, and children woke to empty cupboards. Every day was a negotiation with fate. Small victories, a loaf of bread, a day's work, a safe night in a shelter, were celebrated as triumphs. The Depression was not just an economic event, it was an emotional and moral test, revealing both the worst and best of human nature. By the end of 1930, the nation had settled into a grim rhythm. Bread lines, soup kitchens, and dust-covered highways had become daily realities. Yet within that rhythm, life endured. Clara's small network of support became a lifeline for dozens, and James, humbled and reshaped by the ordeal, began to see a different kind of wealth, the wealth of community, empathy, and shared struggle. It was a fragile kind of hope, but it was real, and it would carry them forward into the uncertain years ahead. The Depression was no longer a temporary misfortune. It had become a defining chapter of American history, touching every life, reshaping every expectation, and forcing people to confront the fragility of their dreams. And in the midst of it all, Clara and James, two strangers whose paths had crossed briefly in the chaos, were learning the most important lesson of all, that humanity could survive even in the darkest times, but only if people refused to abandon one another. By 1933, the cracks in America's foundation had become impossible to ignore. Bread lines and shuttered storefronts were no longer temporary inconveniences. They were the new reality. Yet, amidst the despair, the first glimmers of change began to appear. Franklin D. Roosevelt had taken office as president, promising bold action and a New Deal to revive the nation. News of government programs spread like wildfire, bringing hope to those who had long lived with uncertainty. For Clara Thompson, this was more than policy. It was validation of the struggle she had endured. And for James Carter, it was a call to action, a chance to transform the lessons he had learned in suffering into something meaningful. Clara found herself drawn to the burgeoning labor movement. Factories had begun reopening, but conditions were harsh, and employers exploited workers' desperation. She joined a group of women advocating for fair wages, shorter hours, and safer working conditions. Meetings were held in cramped basements or community halls, where voices rose in solidarity, demanding dignity and respect. Clara became a natural leader, her determination inspiring others to act. Strikes were organized with careful strategy, leveraging the power of collective action to force management to negotiate. In a nation plagued by fear and instability, Clara discovered that courage was contagious, and unity could achieve what individual effort could not. Meanwhile, James thought to make amends for his past arrogance. He volunteered in public works programs, digging trenches, building roads, and assisting in the construction of public buildings. He learned to lift heavy loads, to sweat under the sun, and to endure exhaustion without complaint. For the first time in his life, he understood the dignity of labor, the profound satisfaction of work that served the community rather than personal profit. Working alongside men who had lost everything, he discovered humility and empathy. He no longer measured worth by bank balances or social standing. Instead, he measured it by resilience, perseverance, and the capacity to help others. The New Deal programs, such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, and the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, transformed landscapes and lives. Dust Bowl refugees planted trees to combat soil erosion. Workers built bridges, schools, and roads that would stand for generations. James and Clara observed the changes with cautious optimism. Each brick laid, each mile of road paved was more than infrastructure. It was proof that a nation could rebuild, even from the depths of despair. Yet the progress was slow and even. Many people continued to suffer, and skepticism remained. Could the government truly lift the country from economic ruin, or were these efforts too little, too late? For Clara, hope was tested daily. One morning, she arrived at a strike meeting, only to hear that management had hired scabs and threatened to fire anyone who participated.
Fear rippled through the room, but she spoke with unwavering resolve, urging her peers to stand firm. "Our labor is our dignity," she said, her voice rising over the murmurs of doubt. "Without it, we are nothing. Together, we are strong." Her courage inspired action, and the strike succeeded in securing modest wage increases and safer working conditions. It was a victory small in scale but monumental in significance, reinforcing the power of unity in the face of systemic injustice. James, too, faced tests of character. At a CCC camp outside New York, he struggled to gain the trust of men who had long held contempt for bankers and brokers. He worked alongside them, listening to their stories of loss and humiliation, offering whatever help he could without seeking recognition. Slowly, he became accepted, not as a former insider of privilege, but as one of them, a man transformed by experience. One evening, after a grueling day of clearing debris and planting trees, a fellow worker clapped him on the shoulder. "You've changed, Carter," he said. "You get it now. We all do." That simple acknowledgement validated the long, difficult journey he had undertaken, from arrogance to empathy, from isolation to community. Across the country, America began to feel the impact of collective action and policy reform. Social Security, unemployment relief, and public works projects created tangible improvements. Families who had gone hungry for months received food assistance. Farmers, battered by the Dust Bowl, were offered subsidies and guidance to restore their soil. The narrative of survival shifted from individual struggle to shared effort, reinforcing the idea that hope was not an abstraction. It was built, brick by brick, act by act. Yet for every success, there were setbacks. Corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and lingering economic instability meant that relief often arrived slowly. Clara and James learned patience alongside determination. Clara negotiated with factory managers, brokered compromises, and mentored younger activists who looked to her for guidance. James coordinated local construction crews, ensuring projects were completed efficiently and fairly, advocating for fair wages and humane working conditions. Both understood that rebuilding a nation required more than policy. It required vigilance, integrity, and unyielding commitment. In the evenings, as Clara returned to her modest apartment, she would write letters to families who had been displaced, offering encouragement and advice. She became a symbol of hope in her neighborhood, someone who had endured loss and emerged stronger. James, meanwhile, used his knowledge of finance to assist small business owners struggling to navigate new regulations and recover lost capital. Together, though their paths were different, they embodied the spirit of resilience sweeping across the country. The turning point came one autumn afternoon. Clara visited a nearby town hit hard by unemployment, organizing a community kitchen. As she distributed bread and stew, she watched children play in the dirt, laughing despite hunger and exhaustion. James had accompanied her, helping with logistics and carrying supplies. In that moment, they both realized that the Depression had taught the country more than hardship. It had taught empathy, ingenuity, and solidarity. It had forced ordinary Americans to rediscover the value of human connection, to act not merely for survival, but for the collective good. As 1934 approached, signs of recovery were tangible yet fragile. Unemployment, though still high, had begun to decline in areas affected by New Deal projects. Factories reopened, farms stabilized, and urban communities reorganized to support one another. Clara continued her advocacy work, while James focused on rebuilding trust in business and labor collaboration. They understood that the nation's scars would not heal overnight, and that the lessons of the Depression must be remembered, lest history repeat itself.
By 1937, the nation was slowly emerging from the shadows of the Great Depression. The streets that once echoed with the cries of hunger now carried the tentative sounds of recovery. Children laughing in schoolyards, shopkeepers cautiously opening doors, and the steady rhythm of factories resuming production. Yet the memories of hardship lingered, etched into the lives of those who had endured them. For Clara Thompson and James Carter, the decade of struggle had reshaped not only the country, but their very identities. Clara had become a recognized leader in labor reform. Her tireless advocacy had won fair wages and safer conditions in factories across Detroit. She spent her mornings inspecting workplaces, ensuring compliance with new regulations, and mentoring younger women who sought to make their voices heard. She had learned that true change required persistence, patience, and courage, the kind of courage that flourished even in the smallest acts, organizing a protest, sharing scarce food, or standing up to a hostile employer. For Clara, the Depression had not only been a test of survival, but a crucible that forged her into someone capable of inspiring others. James, meanwhile, had returned to the world of finance, but in a radically different way. He founded a small community bank aimed at helping struggling families and local businesses rebuild. Gone were the reckless gambles of his youth. Instead, he applied his knowledge to prudent investments and sustainable growth. He worked closely with local organizations, offering advice, small loans, and guidance to entrepreneurs who had been crushed by the economic collapse. The man who had once measured success by wealth alone now measured it by the lives he could lift and the communities he could strengthen. Their paths crossed frequently, not by coincidence, but through a shared commitment to rebuilding America.
One crisp autumn morning, they met at a public works dedication ceremony for a new school funded by the WPA. Children ran across the freshly paved playground, their laughter carrying across the brick and mortar of a building that had been constructed by hands that had known hunger and despair. Clara and James watched in silence, both reflecting on how far the country had come and how far they themselves had traveled from the fear and uncertainty of the early 1930s. The nation, too, had begun to heal. New Deal programs had stabilized banks, provided employment, and implemented social safety nets that prevented widespread destitution from recurring so easily. Farmers had been offered support through subsidies and soil restoration projects, while the Dust Bowl's devastation was gradually being reversed through conservation efforts. Unemployment remained a concern, but there was a growing sense of hope, a belief that America could withstand adversity if its people worked together. Yet recovery was not without lingering scars. Families who had lost homes, businesses, or loved ones still carried invisible burdens. Children who had grown up hungry and fearful bore memories that would influence their adult lives. Clara often visited families who were still struggling to regain stability, offering assistance, guidance, and moral support. She knew that rebuilding the nation required more than infrastructure. It required nurturing the social and emotional fabric that had been torn by despair. James focused on the economic side of recovery, helping small business owners regain their footing. He counseled merchants who had survived on scraps of savings, offering guidance on bookkeeping, marketing, and prudent investment. He also mentored younger bankers, instilling in them the lessons he had learned the hard way, the dangers of speculation, the moral responsibilities of wealth, and the importance of serving the broader community. The financial systems that had once driven excess were being rebuilt with wisdom gained from failure. For both Clara and James, personal growth had paralleled national recovery. Clara had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that ordinary people could wield extraordinary influence when driven by necessity and moral conviction. James, once a man of arrogance and privilege, had learned humility, compassion, and the transformative power of service. Their experiences were intertwined with the broader story of America, a nation tested, scarred, yet ultimately strengthened by the trials of the Depression. The legacy of the Great Depression extended far beyond the immediate relief programs and public works. Communities had learned to rely on one another, to organize, and to act collectively. Labor movements had strengthened, securing rights that would protect workers for generations. Social programs established in the 1930s created safety nets that would endure, offering protection against the volatility of future economic crises. And perhaps most importantly, Americans carried forward a newfound respect for resilience, perseverance, and the capacity for empathy. Clara and James often reflected on the years they had lived through. Clara remembered the nights spent in dimly lit basements distributing bread to families whose eyes held despair. She remembered the faces of children who had gone hungry and the courage of women who refused to give up despite exhaustion and fear. James recalled the frigid mornings working in public works crews, the humiliation of once having everything and losing it all, and the humbling gratitude of communities learning to trust him despite his past. Those memories shaped their decisions, their values, and their commitment to the future. By the late 1930s, the country was not only recovering, it was transforming. The Depression had forced Americans to confront the weaknesses in their economic and social systems, and to innovate in ways that would shape the next generation. Public works projects had rebuilt infrastructure, labor laws had created protections, and social programs had established a foundation for stability. Individuals like Clara and James had demonstrated that ordinary people could have extraordinary influence, and that personal courage and collective action were essential to survival. In the final scenes, Clara and James walk through a rebuilt neighborhood, children playing safely in the streets, shops reopening, and neighbors greeting one another with smiles instead of fear. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden light over the bricks and pavement that had been laid by hands that knew suffering firsthand. For the first time in nearly a decade, there was a sense of normalcy, tempered by memory and tempered by vigilance. As the story closes, the lesson is clear. The Great Depression was more than an economic catastrophe. It was a moral, social, and emotional trial. It tested the limits of human endurance, reshaped the nation's policies, and forged individuals who carried forward lessons of resilience, empathy, and solidarity. Clara and James, having survived the worst, had emerged wiser, stronger, and committed to a better future. And the nation, battered yet unbroken, had begun to reclaim its promise, proving that even in the darkest times, hope, courage, and community could endure.